What the f*** is this piece of
I'm just messing with you.
The other thing?
Yeah. It's gonna happen.
Hello everyone, it's your favorite Dragonslayer here, and as I'm sure you're all aware by this point, Warner Bros. Decided they want to come back to the Middle-earth playground to assert their dominance on Amazon after their grand failure known as Rings of Power, and because David Zaslav knows he needs a guaranteed cash cow franchise that will help reduce the company's ever-increasing debt.
You don't say. Huh?
Now, I'm going to give you the 5 possible movie predictions that I think Warner Bros. Could potentially make in the coming years, and I'm going to sort it by what I believe to be the most likely to come out based off of my knowledge of the lore, but know that at the end of the day, these are my opinions I'm making, and that they may or may not get any confirmation until more news articles come out about Warner Bros. Intends to do with their movies and this franchise.
I just want to tell you both good luck. We're all counting on you.
However, before I begin, I do need to ask you guys to put down in the comments section what your predictions are when it comes to potential Middle-earth movies, but also know that I will hold myself back with lore dumping since all I want to do is give you guys movie predictions rather than a lesson in Middle-earth lore.
Well, thanks for your restraint.
Also, I am still working on that Demolition Man review, so please know that it's coming, but I just felt strongly compelled to want to talk about this topic, since Tolkien is near and dear to my heart, as you all may know through my old Rings of Power reviews, which you can check out in the playlist mentioned above, and that, one day will get remastered by yours truly.
Hell yeah.
With that, let's jump straight into the unknown void that is, how in Eru's name could Warner Brothers flesh out the rich lore of this magical part of Arda? This one is what I believe to be the most probable movie to come out of Warner Brothers in the coming years, since this story could easily create a prequel-like setup for the Middle-earth Cinematic Universe, or the MECU as I like to call it, that Warner Brothers is trying to achieve with future movies, but god, it feels weird saying it since it sounds like a Middle-earth version of the MCU. Ugh. The plot would have Isildur and Elrond as the main characters and would follow both of their stories in parallel until they both merge together into one story when both the Númenóreans and elves assemble to plan their assault on Sauron's domain. And as for what stories could be told about both men before we get to that merging point, well, one would be of Isildur's flight from Númenor before its downfall and the establishment of the realms in exile of Arnor and Gondor with his father Elendil and his brother Anarion, but also the struggles both he and his brother had to go through in order to hold a line against Sauron while the alliance was being assembled. For Elrond, it would be mostly showcasing his skill as a seasoned commander of elven armies and as the right-hand herald of Gil-galad, while Gil-galad himself is allowed to show his quality as a leader and as the last High King of the Noldor. The story would then start to focus on their journey to gather the support of the Wood Elves of Lothlorien and Greenwood, or Mirkwood as it would be later known, and the few dwarves of various clans that decided to go with this massive army to what they thought was certain doom. During this gathering stage, Warner Bros. Could, if they have really good scriptwriters, quickly introduce and flesh out Thranduil and his father Oropher and the king of Lorien, Amdir, but they could also showcase the animosity both kings had against Gil-galad being named the supreme commander of the elven armies.
What a twist!
They then would have to focus on the bloody Battle of Dagorlad and the 7-year-long siege of Sauron's Tower of Barad-dûr, culminating in the final battle where Sauron duels both Elendil and Gil-galad that ends in both kings dying to Sauron, but his physical form also ends up being grievously wounded by them, which then allows Isildur to cut off Sauron's ring finger as a weregild, ending the conflict once and for all, while showcasing the scene where he ends up getting killed in the Anduin by orcs and what led to that in the disaster of the Gladden Fields that sets up the theme for the movies that will portray Sauron's future conflicts with the free peoples of Middle-earth.
Very interesting.
For this story, Warner Bros. Could either make one really long film or 2 movies at most, but they would have to nail the tone of the story correctly in order for the audience to be engaged. But they should also make it clear that this is a time where the forces of good suffer terrible constant losses against Sauron throughout the Second Age, and even though the situation seems hopeless, the Free People still gather their strength to create the second most massive coalition army to ever exist on Middle-earth since the War of Wrath in the First Age to end Sauron's darkness.
Hey, that's pretty good.
It should focus on the fact that when both sides fight each other, that one side is fighting a desperate defensive battle where there is no turning back, and that the other side is filled with fanatical followers that will do whatever is necessary to secure their future under their new Dark Master, even if it means fighting extremely tough, disciplined, well-armed, and fearless warriors like the Elves and Numenorians. If they can get this tone right, the ballpark is open to them to create more stories like this one.
But wait! There's more!
This one could easily be a series of 3 to 6 movies or more if Warner Brothers plays their cards right, but the story focus would basically be in the 600-year period where Sauron sends out the Witch King of Angmar on a secret mission where he is tasked with gathering an army strong enough to challenge and destroy the northern kingdom of the Dunedain known as Arnor. The protagonist throughout most of the story would be the Witch King, as we see from his perspective how he deceived one of the already fragmented kingdoms of Arnor into his service, and how he waged a 5-century-long war against the kingdoms of Cardolan and Arthedain, which ended in him ultimately destroying all 3 kingdoms with the fall of Fornost, the massive depopulation of Eriador at the time due to his armies, and a great plague ravaging the land later on, and how the Dunedain survivors with their first chieftain Aranarth, son of the last official king of Arthedain, Arvedui, became the Dunedain Rangers that Aragorn belongs to.
Okay, keep going.
In the story, Elrond, Glorfindel, and Círdan would play their roles as allies to the kingdoms of Cardolan and Arthedain in pushing back the Witch King's armies many times, and eventually they would all come together with King Arnor of Gondor in a coalition army with the Gondor and Arnor Dunedain to defeat the Witch King in the plains of Fornost, but they would also push him back to the point where his kingdom and armies would be completely destroyed by this coalition, who would later find out the Witch King's true nature as a Nazgul through Glorfindel. They could also quickly cover the events where the king Arnor of Gondor, after achieving his victory against the Witch King, left his crown behind after giving in to the Witch King's taunts from Minas Morgul to challenge him in single combat.
Dumb ass.
Since the events discussed here are mostly mentioned in the appendices of the Lord of the Rings books, they could easily make compelling stories that respect the lore and fill in the gaps between the major events that happen decades or centuries apart from each other in this conflict. However, this will require a lot of time, money, and effort in order to bring the story to light, because the people involved would have to be knowledgeable of Tolkien's universe in order to create stories that fill in those gaps in a lore-friendly way while adhering to the overarching story. And from what I've seen from Warner Brothers' Hobbit trilogy, I do feel kind of skeptical, since that trilogy prioritized money to pay off debts rather than giving their suddenly hired director Peter Jackson more pre-production time to make good movies out of that story, which is why we ended up with that rushed, underwhelming adaptation of a one-book story.
Emotional damage!
This story would take place into the Third Age, where the Dwarves of Erebor have been exiled for some years, and they end up petitioning aid with Thorin's father, King Thrain II, from all the other 6 dwarf clans in order to gather a large enough army in 3 years to avenge the gruesome death of his father, King Thror, at the hands of Azog. The details behind this war are incredibly vague, and all we know is that it was mostly fought underground and then it lasted for 6 years. That the dwarves sacked all orc strongholds in the Misty Mountains, from Mount Gundabad to the far north, all the way down to Gladden in the far south, and that the war ended after the final battle of Azanulbizar, where King Dane Ironfoot slew Azog by decapitating him, and where Thorin earned the Oakenshield title. It was a Pyrrhic victory where the dwarves lost half of their remaining army, and the orcs suffered such massive casualties that they would not be able to recover their numbers until Azog's son Bolg led a massive army to attack the elves, dwarves, and Lake Town men in the Battle of the Five Armies 142 years later. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of you guys that are now typing in the comments like, what is this guy talking about? The Hobbit movies already showed us that Azog survived that war and that Thror was killed in that battle and they never showed up. Just shut up, okay? Because the story of Azog being the big bad commander of the evil orcs during the Battle of Five Armies, or Thror being killed by him in that battle, is not lore accurate, alright?
Fool of a took.
Fans who read the books before and after those movies came out have always asked the question of why they did that lore blunder, and all we can come up with is that they needed an extra villain so that the shoehorned, gravity-defying Legolas could have a conflict arc with some high-level orcs so he didn't feel pointless in the entire movie trilogy.
That's f***ed up.
Anyways, if Warner Brothers decided to make a movie or two about the story, they would either have to embrace the flashback story of The Hobbit and adapt the story where the flashback still makes sense to those who watched the movies of The Hobbit, or they would have to completely retcon the Azog portion of The Hobbit movies and just make a more lore-accurate version of it. However, since the description of the 6-year-long war is very vague, they would have to create an original script that respects the lore and fills in the gaps of those years that leads to the Battle of Asanulbizar, which I will admit is going to be very difficult unless some top-tier writers and directors who are passionate about Tolkien are involved, because otherwise this type of movie could easily bomb under the wrong hands, and as we have seen with Warner Brothers' TV cousin Amazon with that travesty known as Rings of Power.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
These movies seem to be the most likely and safer options that Warner Brothers could go with after the War of the Last Alliance prequel idea, since the stories of these battles can easily be told with just one movie each. They would have to go into some detail of how these battles were won and the fact that they were happening at the same time as the Battle of Minas Tirith, but also it would need to showcase the fact that Sauron's forces at the time of the War of the Ring were truly massive, since he was able to gather enough troops to keep the dwarves of Erebor and the Wood Elves of Lothlorien and Mirkwood occupied for a long while, until he was able to annihilate the kingdoms of Gondor and Rohan by cutting them off from any aid of the elves and dwarves. In these movies, you could showcase the legendary heroism of King Brand of Dale and King Dane as great warriors and leaders, but they can also show the audience how their relationship builds up to this deep friendship between man and dwarf that can explain why Dane would die in the field of battle to protect the body of his dearest ally. Other than that, the rest of the battle near the end is a long, drawn-out siege due to Erebor's big defenses that they can easily time skip until the forces of Easterlings and Orcs run away in fear once they hear the news that Sauron has been defeated. As for the elven battles of Lothlorien and Mirkwood, Warner Brothers would have to use their writers to come up with a story that can accomplish telling the audience what Thranduil, Celeborn, and Galadriel were doing while they were getting assaulted by orc attacks from Dol Guldur. They not only would have to make it clear that Thranduil's forces won the Battle of Mirkwood at the cost of the forest being left in great ruin of fire and presumably many of their people dying, but also the fact that 2 more assaults afterwards, Celeborn and Galadriel would defeat the remaining orc forces, seize control of Dol Guldur, and destroyed once and for all with the power of Galadriel's Ring of Power, Nenya.
You're goddamn right.
Again, this part of the lore is left intentionally vague to either let the reader's imagination run wild or because Tolkien wanted to come back to flesh out the story more, but we will never know because the professor has long passed beyond the halls of Mandos to meet Eru himself, so we can only speculate with this prediction. And while you're thinking about what that could be, could you please be so kind as to support your boy with a quick like, share, and subscribe while hitting the all notifications bell? It lets YouTube know that you like watching my videos and lets them promote it more so that even more people can see what you liked. This story would probably be one of those most likely movies Warner Brothers would make, since it wouldn't require that much effort to tell an interesting origin story for the future king of the reunited kingdom of Gondor and Arnor, since half of his story has already been told really well thanks to the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Damn straight.
The only story bits they would need to focus on is his early life in Rivendell after his father's death, his meeting of his future wife Arwen, the journeys he undertook in helping to protect Gondor and Rohan against Sauron and his allies, and then the movie would end at the part where Gandalf asked him to join him in the hunt for Gollum.
There, easy as pie.
Like you've probably heard me say many times over, it wouldn't require that much effort from Warner Brothers' part to make at least half of the predictions I mentioned here into easy moneymakers for themselves and great pieces of entertainment for the Tolkien fanbase. However, what they will need to do in order to achieve this is to hire people who are not only good at the roles they play on or off camera, but also passionate about the universe Tolkien himself created, because otherwise none of these movie predictions will succeed and may turn out to be worse expensive failures than Rings of Power, which honestly makes me shudder at the thought after being exposed to that shit show.
You! I ain't having that shit!
Also, the biggest thing Warner Brothers must focus on is to make the best movie adaptations that they can of the professor's work, and also to make sure to leave modern politics and ideas out of his world just because they want to pander to a small minority of crazy people. And please stop inserting hobbits into every fucking movie that's ever been made of Middle-earth, okay? We don't need them anymore.
Stop it. Get some help.
If they do that, then we of the Tolkien fanbase may find some newfound hope for future adaptations of Middle-earth stories. And with that, friends, I wish you all a wonderful day and Namarie.